Extended QA if you want to catch me there. And as for me,
please welcome Mr. Chicken Rocket to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone didn't party too hard last night and ready to hear some dense facts on optimization. Hi, I'm Peter McNeil, otherwise known as Mr. Chicken Rocket. I've been in the Roblox community now for about 7 years, and outside of Roblox, I've been making games for about 25 years. And as for the name, Mr. Chicken Rocket, well, my kids gave me that name because they wanted me to go play this thing called Bee Swarm Simulator with them about 7 years ago, and I kept the account, and so the name's stuck ever since. And hi, just before we begin, just a few ground rules. Please keep your arms and legs inside of the ride at all times. There's no need to take pictures of the slides because this will all be put online afterwards. And there's a really good summary slide right at the end too. And we'll hold off until questions at the end, like with most of these talks. And there's going to be a QA room across the hall afterwards to do a bit of an extended QA if you want to catch me there. And as for me, I did some stuff. Back in the olden days, I worked on Fruit Ninja, and I've worked on many versions of Fruit Ninja since then. I worked on Fruit Ninja VR, Fruit Ninja Connect, Fruit Ninja Xbox, all of them basically. I also worked on this game called Jetpack Joyride, which I keep getting told that was a bunch of you's childhood game, and that makes me feel really old. Yeah, back in the day, that game had to ship in under 20 megabytes, so that was a real engineering feat to get that thing to even ship. And more recently, I was over in Sweden working on this thing, which I think some of you might have heard of. I was the engine director on Candy Crush for a few years. On Roblox, myself, I've worked on a whole bunch of stuff, and I've worked with a whole bunch of really excellent, amazing teams. I've shipped a couple of games myself, and I've released some open source software. But probably the most important thing, and why I'm up here talking about this today, is that I love optimizing games. I love understanding how they run and how they perform. And I've got information that I can share with all of you about that. So that leads to today's talk, using the ROBLOX tools that exist to improve performance, which really comes down to starting by health checking your game. And so why do we care? Why do we care about optimizing our games? Because Roblox's long-term vision is that you don't have to optimize your games, and Roblox will take care of all of this for you. But the truth is that right now, optimized games make more money. They announced at the keynote that Roblox engine optimizations have added an extra 300 million play hours over the course of since they've added them. And the truth is that more than half of your players are on mobile. Optimized games also get played longer. So people are having a session on their mobile phone, they're playing it, and if the phone starts cooking in their hand and catching on fire, they're not going to play it as long as they're going to play it if it wasn't doing that. On top of that, there's other things that count as optimization, which is load times for your games. So you've got a game, it's loading up, and if it's taking 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, I don't know about you, but ADHD sometimes kicks in, and I'm over on TikTok, come back to the game, and what was I doing? You know, that's not a good result that you want for your players. The good news is, and the real point of this talk, is that Roblox has great tooling to help you monitor and track down and overall check on the health of your project so that you can tell how it's going to run on these devices. And my philosophy is that it's way better to stay on top of performance and optimization as you work on your project, as opposed to making it a process that you try and do at the end. So you let your performance fall, you do an optimization pass, you come back. It's better to avoid all of that and just work on it as you go. So that's what this talk today is all about. So diving right in, I've profiled and optimized a lot of games at this point. I've worked with a lot of teams. People send me builds all of the time and say, hey, why is my game running badly? And I've seen some crazy stuff. But honestly, there's these 6 points that I'm going to bring up right now. Most games that have performance problems have problems with one of these 6 points. So that's excessive triangle count, excessive draw call count. I'm going to explain what draw calls are if you don't know, if you haven't heard that term before, I'll dive into that. High CPU usage, high memory usage, long loading times, and excessive bandwidth usage. So I'll run you through the tooling that Roblox has for all of this today and show you how to tell where your game fits on that and some current appropriate benchmarks and standards for that if you're targeting mobile phones. So to start with, triangles. Now, you're going to have to forgive me for this one because this is a very high-level, top-level talk. I have to tell you that everything in Roblox is made out of triangles. So this means your meshes, your parts, your unions, your terrain, all of it. It's all triangles. That's the primary way that Roblox gets things drawn on screen. The main problem with triangles, however, is that most people don't pay attention to it. And as a developer community, we're kind of excessive with it. We use a lot of triangles in our things. We treat triangles as high fidelity models. We treat it as the mark of quality. And truthfully, our scenes are excessive with it. So the number of triangles that you have in your scene, that affects your rendering performance pretty linearly. Roblox does some things to try and scale down the number of triangles that you use, based upon performance and distance and LOD. But genuinely, if you have rendering and you have a 2 million triangle scene, that takes about twice as long to rasterize as a 1 million triangle scene. So it affects things pretty linearly. So the total number of triangles you're pushing out to the scene really does affect your rendering performance. So how do you check your, just pause for a split second. When you're caring about the triangles in your scene, what I'm actually talking about is what your camera can see right now. So like triangles that are to the left of the camera or to the right of the camera, or now because we have the new occlusion culling, triangles that are behind things that are being occluded culling. Occlusion culling is amazing, right? Like, let's round of applause for the engineers for that one. But the only triangles you care about are the triangles that are actually on scene for your current thing. So when I say scene triangles, that's what I'm referring to. And how do you check your scene triangle counts? Well, that's really easy. It's the shortcuts that I'm showing on screen now, which is Control Shift F2 for studio or Command Shift F2 for in studio if you're on a Mac. And so when you're actually looking for your triangles and you're looking for your optimization, what I usually do is I go and find a hotspot in the scene, jump down, pull up the rendering stats menu like so, and I look around and find the hotspot. I look for when this number here, this is the most important stat in all of the rendering stats, even though it's quite an information dense screen, is your draw scene numbers there, which is, I keep pointing at the teleprompter, sorry about that. So its number of draw calls is the first number, and the second number is the number of triangles. So this scene is drawing 77 draw calls for the scene triangle, and it's drawing 130,000 odd triangles in this view for the triangle count. There's a lot of other numbers in the rendering stats, and I'll cover a few of them in a minute, but this is the primary one that I use when I'm looking at people's rendering performance, because it tells you the overall health of the rendering scene. So how many triangles do we use? Like this one's doing 130,000. What's a good budget for your game and for your mobile phone with the state of Roblox as it is now and the types of device we're trying to target? This graph gives us a little bit of an insight into that. So this graph tells us how many triangles a bunch of different devices over time could comfortably render and stay at 60 frames per second. So all the way back on the left, we have the Nintendo 64, which could render about 2,000 triangles per frame and stay on 30 frames per second, because it was a 30 frames per second device. And all the way on the right, we have the PlayStation 5, which has a scene triangle budget of about 10 million, because that thing's a beast. And then as we go along, we have things like just on the right of where I've picked the iPhone 6 and the Galaxy 6S phone, that is at about 1 million triangles for the PlayStation 3. Does everyone remember the PlayStation 3, or is that like your dad's gaming console? Right, anyway, so we're at about the 500,000 point for the iPhone 6S and the Samsung Galaxy 6S. And the reason why I picked that phone as a good benchmark to tell people, hey, look, target this one, is because those are 2 GB devices, those are very low spec, and 90% of your player base or more, like even will have something better than that to play on. So this is right down the bottom. It's not the very worst possible phone, but it covers 90% of your player base if you can make it run well on that target. So next up, let's cover draw calls. The mysterious magical draw calls. What are draw calls? Well, draw calls kill your performance. Draw calls are the most misunderstood part about rendering performance on Roblox, because people think the total number of triangles is the only thing that really affects things. It's like, my scene has 4 million triangles. And it's like, well, that's not the only thing that affects how fast it renders. Because draw calls are a command that gets sent from the engine to the rendering pipeline on the device that say, draw something. So every draw call is a combination of, this is massively oversimplifying, so any rendering engineers here, please forgive me. But this is each command, a draw call command, is a combination of a mesh and a material. So in this case, we have a teapot, which is our mesh, and then the material that goes with it. So a lot of games are like 4 to 8 times over budget on this. They've got 2,000 scene draw calls or 4,000 scene draw calls. But honestly, every draw call that you put out has a fixed performance cost in it, even if it only has 1 triangle in it. And so you can very quickly make your scene run slowly, even though you're not rendering much stuff, if you're blowing out your draw call budget. But Pete, you're saying, If we only have 500 draw calls, how are we rendering scenes with 10,000 or 100,000 parts in it? And the truth of that is that there's something else going on. Now, ROBLOX can let you build exactly the same thing in maybe 10 different ways. You can build it out of parts or unions or meshes or however you're going to put it together. But not all of those are created equal, and especially not all created equal when it comes to how many draw calls those things consume. So what ROBLOX has internally is a process called geometry instancing. So sometimes some things take more than one draw call to draw, or take a single draw call, or some things can get packed into the same draw call and you end up only having to use one draw call to draw a whole bunch of things. So this is our example here with the teapot. If this works, it should animate when I click. Right, so we have this teapot moving around. The position's moving, the color's moving, the scale's moving, the rotation's moving. And all of these things can be changed without making it cost any more draw calls than it currently is. So all 4 of these teapots are being output by the rendering system in just one draw call. That's really the power of geometry instancing. And now, because we're eating pretty good as developers this year, we now have surface appearance color 3s. These also batch, so I think they need a round of applause for that one too. I actually had a note there saying hold for applause, so that was great. Yes. So anything that batches, anything that doesn't break the batching, you should be using those freely. So when you're doing your builds and you're like, can I change the parts on these without change the color on these parts without affecting draw calls? The answer is yeah. Like all of these properties can be changed and it really aids in your ability to go and kit bash your scenes together. And if you want to hear a spooky campfire story about the olden days of game development, back in the olden days on the iPhone 4 when we were shipping Jetpack, do you know what our scene draw call budget was? It was 40. So 500's not the hugest budget in the world, but it's a lot better than what it used to be. And continuing with batching. Batching is good, but it's not magic. So this is an animated slide, so I'm going to press the button on this in just a second. Different mesh IDs with different material combinations always go into a new draw call. So although you might have the same mesh, if you have a concrete one and then you have a glass one, that's going to be 2 different draw calls. It has to be the same mesh and the same mesh ID, and the same material for this magic to work. And so internally, all of the different block types like wedges, balls, cylinder parts, and all of these things, internally they're just meshes too, so they all start going into their own batches as well. But where people usually get caught off guard about batching, because things do batch together if they're the same thing, is when you start introducing transparency, funnily enough. Once transparency is introduced, the scene has to stop and start rendering of things to basically get things sorted in the right order. It has to draw from back to front. And then once you have that happening, you have to introduce more draw calls. So I'll press play on this slide just for a second. And if you watch very carefully what's going on, you'll see that as you introduce more boxes and you change properties, the number of draw calls is staying the same. 2 draw calls once you introduce a decal, but now that we start introducing transparency, this thing that was 2 draw calls when it wasn't transparent is now 16 draw calls now that it is. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're working with transparency and looking at your batching. And as with everything, I'm not saying don't use transparency, just be aware that it can add on to your total scene draw call count. When it comes to decals and texture image instances, these can also surprisingly add to your draw call count very quickly. And both of those also add to your triangle count too, because anything with a decal on it or a texture instance on it has to re-render that mesh so that it fits onto the geometry. So that can catch people off guard as well. So this is a talk about health checks. How do you check on your draw calls? Well, the truth is when you go to check on your draw calls, it's exactly the same rendering stats menu that we were looking at before. We had the draw calls, that's that number there, and then you had your scene triangles. So it's the same as before. This scene here is using 276 draw calls. And as I mentioned before, there's a bunch of other numbers in this rendering stat that also contribute to your scene draw. So scene is the most important one, but secondary one is the UI. The UI in ROBLOX is just geometry, meshes, and materials, the same as everything else. And if you're paying attention and you have a very UI-heavy scene, you'll see that the draw calls for your scene UI really starts to climb up. And if you're budgeting and you're caring about how many draw calls your scene is producing, you pretty much just subtract the UI ones from your total budget. So if your scene has 150 UI draw calls, well, your actual rendering, you should be targeting about 350. You probably don't have it that high, but if it does start really climbing up, you might want to have a look into it, especially for rendering on mobile. Depth, the depth number of draw calls is largely ignorable. The devices that use the depth pre-pass, which is what this draw stat is about, that's usually the PC. It's not the mobile devices at the moment. And PCs are much, much more powerful than mobile phones. Remember, we're building like a minimum draw call set here. So a PC can do 4,000 draw calls. It doesn't care about it. So having some extra draw calls being spent on the depth pre-pass isn't something you need to concern yourself about, which is why it's marked as ignorable up on the slides. And shadow draw calls is complicated. I could give a whole talk on just how to optimize your scenes regarding shadow and light rendering, because what happens is every time a light moves, every time something that's being affected by a light moves, every time where shadows are casting moves, every time a player moves inside of shadows, shadow atlases have to get re-rendered, and when shadow atlases need to get updated, that costs shadow draw calls, which is what you're looking at with these stats. And some shadows have to get rendered twice because they're part of like a big scene cascade texture. Generally, the number that I say to people to look out for here is if this is the 3 times multiple of your scene draw calls, you're in a healthy state. But if it starts going higher than that, so if your scene budget's 500, this is 1,500, 3,000, 5,000, if it's really stacking up, then perhaps you need to look at how the lighting in your scene is being done. And remember, this only applies to rendering modes and setups that actually have shadows. So this is like future, shadow map, and older compatibility shadows, things like that. So here's a bit of a batching cheat sheet for you. When it comes to deciding what batches better inside of your scenes, what uses less draw calls, and what's better to use a lot of inside of your scene, this is sort of the tier list for it. So right up the top, we have using a lot of color 3 changes on things, using a lot of surface appearance color 3 changes on things, C-frame, size, using meshes and surface appearances and materials is really the go-fast path of Roblox, and is really the most optimized way to put things together. But as it moves down, we start getting down to the transparent things right at the bottom, which need to be sorted, and then they take more draw calls up. So the trick with this is that I'm not saying don't use the stuff at the bottom of this list. I'm saying use it sparingly. Keep an eye on the fact that this does affect your scene budgets. Look at that scene budget number all of the time and figure out if this is something that you should be doing more or less of. And remember, when we're talking about budgeting numbers, it's worth adding in here that, okay, I've got a budget of 500 and 500,000 scene triangles. It's better to be under that, you know, like it's supposed to be an upper ceiling. So how did I find this out? Well, the method for finding it out is really primitive, total caveman stuff, actually. All you do is you grab a chunk of geometry out of your scene and you whisk it up into the sky and you start cloning it around with the rendering stats open, because you can see this tree is made up of 2 different mesh parts and, sorry, 2 different mesh parts, and as you clone it around, you can see that this tree is still only taking 2 draw calls. There's 9 or 16 of them there, and it's still just 2 draw calls to render this tree. That's because I can look at that and I can say, this tree batches. But if I go and look at a particle system, I know that one particle system takes 1 draw call, and looking at it on its own, isolated, I can see that when I add another particle system, well, that's 2 draw calls, 5, because there's 5 particle systems, and so on. So if I had 500 particle systems visible in the camera, that's 500 draw calls eaten up just by that alone. Remember, I'm not saying don't use particle systems, I'm just saying be aware that there's a cost associated with them. Now, on to CPU usage. So I've worked with games that have done all this stuff that I just talked about. They've optimized their rendering stats. They've brought down how complex their scenes are. They're really not rendering all that much, and they've been very conscientious about things. But they still have performance problems when they actually get onto mobile phone and are like, what's going on here? Why is my game not running well on mobile? The rendering should be fine. Well, the other half of it is CPU performance. If your CPU performance is taking longer each frame to render than 16 milliseconds, or longer, and if it's longer to render than the actual rendering, then you're going to be running at the speed of the slowest part, which in this case is the CPU usage. And so that leads into a term that's used all across the industry, which is this game CPU bound or is this game GPU bound? And how you tell that inside of Roblox is the same rendering stat that we were using before, the rendering menu. It has the numbers on it, which is how much CPU usage in milliseconds you're using per frame and how much GPU usage you're using per frame. So we can see in this one that the CPU usage is 7.3 milliseconds. If we're targeting 60 frames per second, that's well below that. The magic number for 60 frames per second is 16.66 milliseconds. So we only care about which of these two numbers is bigger, and it's well underneath that, and so we're all good. But CPU usage is not like GPU usage when it comes to phones. Phones, roughly, on average, especially the low-spec phones, like my iPhone 6S is clocked in at 1 gigahertz, right? That's a quarter of the speed of like your average desktop PC these days. So when you're looking at your PC CPU usage and it's like, oh, my CPU usage is 10 milliseconds per frame and it's kind of chunky, but it's okay on the PC. When you get it onto that low spec phone, it's going to be 40 milliseconds per frame and your game's going to be running at 20 frames per second. So it's really important that you keep an eye on this and understand what you're looking at and test it on device regularly. So, although Roblox can't do much to scale down your CPU usage for you, it does provide a set of really good tools for you to tell where your CPU usage is going. This is the very most basic check to get an overall CPU usage timing check, but there's better tools that you can use as well. The more in-depth way to use it is the microprofiler, where there were some announcements at the keynote of improvements to the microprofiler. They're improving it all of the time. And it's really in-depth and really complex, but there's really amazing documentation on that. And I'm not going to spend any of your time today going into the in-depth details of how to do all of the microprofiler stuff, but it's important that you're aware that it exists and you use it to get a breakdown on where your CPU performance is going. So the other thing is that the microprofiler also applies to your servers when you're building games. So it's not just the client CPU usage that you can dig into with this. You can also connect to your server and get a profile back and look through it and look at what's going on top of the server, even in live games outside of Studio. So in this slide, what I'm trying to show you is a healthy looking bit of CPU usage. And you can tell it's healthy because Roblox has recently added a convenient feature where if there's lots of time left at the end of each frame, the profiler starts turning blue. So if you're seeing lots of blue in the top graph, it means I was sitting around doing nothing, and I'm going to turn the bar blue so that you know that this is a really optimized CPU frame. So blue is good news, but remember mobile is slower and you're probably not going to see blue there. And in the profiler, the other thing to look at is the vertical lines as the basic guide for reading the flame graph is designating a single frame. So you see the vertical lines breaking it up, and we can see that each frame is taking a block of time chunks, and so you can see the flame graph is not filling up the entire frame each frame, which leads us to knowing that this frame, there's plenty of idle time on the CPU. Then, if you do something crazy like this, where you pile up a bunch of A-frames, you're going to have a graph that looks like this. This is perhaps a less healthy CPU frame. I apologize to the physics team in advance. You're really not supposed to do this. But this is a good way to illustrate what's going on when you're really maxing out the CPU on the profiler and you're having a look at it. You can see that there's tons of threads being used, which is each of the horizontal rows, and you can see that there's lots and lots and lots of stuff filling up each one of those rows. So the microprofiler, all of the documentation for what all of these tags mean is online. But generally, if something is using your CPU usage up, it's not going to be mysterious. It is going to show up in the profiler, and you are going to be able to track down what it is. And then the last thing I want to talk about with the microprofiler is excessive scripts are usually your fault. Roblox can't scale down what your scripts are doing. So if you're doing lots and lots of fun stuff inside of your scripts, like doing lots of raycasts, and you're not spreading things out over multiple frames, or you're doing big, powerful loops that touch a lot of stuff in the data model, you're going to see that show up in the microprofiler like this. Like I spawned in 10,000 coins, and it's absolutely chonking out, and it's saying, hey, there's something inside of Heartbeat here that is using up all of your script performance. Now, on to the next bit, which is memory usage. So, this is an important one. If you've ever looked at your device analytics and you see a lot of crashes on phone, what crashes are most of the time in Roblox is really out-of-memory errors. So, what happens is devices have a fixed amount of memory, and as your game starts using up more and more memory, you start approaching a point where the operating system on that phone will first give your game a warning and say, hey, you're using up too much memory, and the engine jumps in and tries to free up some extra memory and try and stay under the limit that it's warning you about. And then if it goes past that, or you're not quick enough, or if it's just in a bad mood, it ejects your game anyway. And that's a super bad experience for the user because the game just goes away. This can also happen if you Alt-Tab out of the game and come back and you're using too much memory, your game will get ejected and you will see a crash in your crash report. So when it comes to using memory and checking on the health of your project, most devices now, as I mentioned before, have at least 2 gigabytes of memory. There was a lot of talk during the keynote about a focus on renewed focus on targeting Android and 2 gigabyte low-end Android devices. And honestly, that's a pretty good safe bet to target these days. Like, I don't know if I'd personally care too much about 1 gigabyte devices anymore. 2 gigabytes is a really good place to target. And if you're targeting 2 gigabyte devices, the magic number when you start getting increased levels of ejection is about 66% of total memory on the device, which ends up being about 1.3 gigabytes. So that's where we end up with a metric, a benchmark for you to say, how much device memory is my client using? Well, 1.3 gigabytes is a really healthy spot for 2 gigabyte devices. And so, the health check side of this, checking on your memory on device is really, really simple. You just hit F9 on a console, and right in the top of the bar, it'll say what your client memory usage is. In this case, it's using about 1.2 gigabytes. There's a caveat on that though. Right now, checking that number inside of Studio doesn't give you an accurate reflection of how much memory you're using on the client, so you have to actually go and load this up in a live game, or even preferably on device, and then go and check your memory usage there that way. The advanced version of checking your memory is also on the same menu. You just click a couple more buttons. There's the developer console where you can click down, you can say memory, and you can click around and then get a really detailed broken down graph of how your memory is used. There's good docs on how to use this thing. They're improving it all of the time. I'm not going to dig into it too much today, but it's good for you to know that this exists. You can check both your client and server memory there, and announce that the keynote was a new X-ray mode for the memory profiling that I'm not sure when that's live, but when it is, you should have a look at it there as well. When it comes to memory usage, why is it always U3 whenever anything happens? So when I've been looking at games, and the main 3 culprits for what's chewing up the most amount of memory in games is these 3 here, which is textures, part count, and honestly, audio files is the one that catches most people off guard if they haven't done any work to optimize their process. So textures, the maximum size texture we can currently upload is currently have rendering in our game is 1024 by 1024, even though you can upload larger or smaller sizes than that. This is the large size that most people use. When you have one of those set up as a surface appearance with all of the goodies attached to it, like a normal map, roughness map, and alpha, that ends up using resident at max in the client of 2.8 megabytes. There's circumstances where the Roblox engine will automatically scale that down, but if you're doing metrics and trying to find out what a good budget is, you can multiply that out and figure out, well, if I've got 100 fully resident surface appearance textures, that's going to multiply out to about just under 300 megabytes of client memory out of that 1.3 gig budget that we were just looking at. For parts, this one catches people off guard all the time too. A part on the client, total system impact at this point is roughly about 1 kilobyte. This means that if you have 250,000 parts coming down to the client, and you can control what comes down to the client by things like streaming enabled or what's actually in the workspace. But the things that actually arrive down on the client, it's 250,000 parts is 250 megabytes. So it's like if I've got 1 million instances in my game, well, you know what your memory usage is going to look like if you multiply that out. And with audio files have to be resident to be played. So if you have instances of audio locally on the client and they're ready to be played, they are also sitting in memory. So a little trick there or a tip there might be to don't put those on the client until they're actually ready to be played. Like if you have 12 3-minute long soundtracks that make up your game soundtrack, shuffle them around a little bit because they're just sitting in memory not doing anything. And as a bonus slide, we saw this at the keynotes, but there's now an analytics dashboard that talks about memory usage on devices and especially crashes on devices in a lot more detail. So I won't get into this too much. It was covered much better in the keynote, but that's there now. So you should definitely go to your analytics and check it out and get a more detailed breakdown of how your memory usage is going. And unfortunately, that's pretty much it for all the fun, pretty slides in the deck. We've covered rendering, we've covered the graphs, and now we're on to the boring bits like progress bars and how long things take to load. So if you've ever wondered why some games take a long time to load and load in, and some games drop in almost instantly, almost all of that comes down to the number of things that need to be replicated to the client before the client is allowed to start up. Instances especially really bog things down. So when I've done benchmarking on this, what I've found is that you get roughly 10,000 instances a second replicated down on Client Connect. So that means if you have 300,000 instances coming down to the client, that's going to be 30 seconds of load time. You should really be careful about managing this. Streaming Enabled is a great tool for bringing in the radius for newly connected players, and you should overall be thinking about how many instances are in your scene anyway. On top of this, if you're doing content-aware loading, where you have a loading bar that's looking at what's coming down in the pipeline and then not letting the player into the game until that's cleared, audio instances can be surprisingly naughty there as well because they have to be fully downloaded. Textures have to be fully downloaded before that gets cleared. And I don't have a bullet point for it, but other players' characters also have to be fully loaded, all of the stuff that's in them. So if a player connects and then another player connects and you're monitoring how much stuff still has to be loaded, that number will climb back up as other players come in and you have to handle their character appearances. So just be aware of that. We're on the home stretch now. We're on to bandwidth usage. When it comes to bandwidth usage, it usually comes down to you have too much moving stuff. So it's nice and easy to finish up with. Server-owned moving assemblies, they all cost about 1 kilobyte per replicated assembly that's moving around on the server. So if you have a bunch of balls rolling around and you have 50 of them rolling around, that's going to use about 50 kilobytes a second of bandwidth. It's a little bit less than that, and Roblox does a lot of things to try and smooth this out for you so you don't care. After you get to about 40 kilobytes a second down on the RECV stat here, it'll start round robin throttling some of things, but that's an implementation detail that's subject to change. They're improving this stuff all of the time, but as things are right now, the rough benchmark is that you should be looking at planning your game around. There should only be about 50 moving things moving around your player that you care about physics-wise at a time. And to see this stat, it's really simple. It's Command F7 or Control F7 if you're on PC, and it's that stat right there. You've probably all seen it before. It's the RECV, and it shows you how many kilobytes per second that you're using. There's lots I could add to this about saying, if this doesn't work for you, you could use custom replication or send events to move things around and things like that. But this is not that kind of talk. So maybe we can cover that in some other talk or some other paper somewhere. And now moving on to in summary. In summary, what this all comes down to is be aware of the current limitations, realistic limitations of where Roblox is right now, and get a budget. So that means covering the things that we talked about before. That's aim for about 500,000 in-scene triangles if you're targeting phone. Aim for about 500 draw calls in scene if you're targeting phone. Aim for a 1.3 client memory. gigabytes of that. I know I said 250,000 as my example for instances before, but I honestly feel like 150,000 is a really good benchmark because you're not blowing your load times out. That's 15 seconds for 150,000 instances. Keep your replication nice and low, and keep your CPU usage as low as you can, because it always surprises people how much slower things are when you actually go and get them onto phone. I know I wasn't suggesting people take photos of any slides, but if you wanted to take a photo of any of them, this would be the one to have the numbers to take with you. And tricks, because you've all taken your phone out, I have a QR code. All right, so I did an article. Some of you are probably aware of it already. I posted, I don't know if I can call it an article, it's more of a book. It has chapters. It's on the dev forum, and it really goes into detail, not just about how to go and check this stuff, but it has some more prescriptive details on things you can do to improve your situation with these. Some building tips, some optimization tips. It's really quite in-depth, so if you want to check that out, that's on the article there. And that's it. We're at the end of the presentation. All right, do we have time for Q&A? Did I go over? Q&A is across in the hall? Okay, yeah, so Q&A is not now, it's going to be across in the hall. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome, from Sawhorse Interactive, Gino Roy to the stage.
What are we doing? So excited. All my favorite people are here. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Jeez Louise, got a lot of fun stuff to show you guys we've been working on. And welcome to Finding Your Art Direction with me, Gino Roy. I go by Heart Hurts on Roblox, and I have spent 4 years on the platform, fairly new. I have a film and animation background, and yeah, I've cut music videos for Mac Miller, Beyonce, Nicki Minaj, and I've cut a couple feature films. I've directed live action commercials and TV series. I spent 5 years doing music, VFX, and animation at Disney. So yeah, a lot of film and animation behind this. I'm an avid pig enthusiast, as you can see from my, my avatar. So if I snort, that's just me being in character. Okay, and I'm based out of Los Angeles, and I work at Sawhorse. Yeah, fun fact, I actually drew this. I spent copious hours trying to, find anything quirky that felt whimsical and part of like what Sawhorse really is. And yeah, I've done a lot of that work at Sawhorse, especially the film background, doing the music videos and becoming an art director and a director in live action. So look at this, all this in 4 years. This is crazy to me. Honestly, being new to the platform, and like 5 years ago, I just thought I was going to be at Leica or like still at Sawhorse doing like animation, like an animation wing. But no, we're here. I love it here. It is amazing. We're so honored to be nominated back-to-back years for best studio. That's crazy. That's crazy to me. So yeah, I started at Sawhorse 10 years ago when we were just doing film. We're a traditional film studio, and doing a bunch of that work. So that's kind of like where my head's at. So, but 4 years ago, we started making Roblox games with mostly filmmakers. Like we had a bunch of filmmakers scratching our heads trying to figure out how we could do this. But we brought on some really passionate devs and Roblox experts and filmmakers like me adapting to the platform. And yeah, we're having a great time. So, our other main art director, who's also a filmmaker, is Jessica Weiss-Thomas. She works out of Alaska. We're a completely remote interactive team. So she works in Alaska. She just had a baby. She's like crazy talented. I'm constantly inspired by her. But yeah, we do a lot of branded content, branded experiences. This is something that Sawhorse has done for even before interactive. We did a lot of branded content, so we're very familiar with telling brand stories, and it's really passionate. We're really passionate about telling those stories in the right way. So I didn't think I was going to be here, but I feel like I've trained my entire life for this. You know, from building blocks to Legos, coloring books, Etch-a-Sketch, and now as a profession, after all of this training, I'm still drawing sketches and playing with blocks. That was my dad, by the way. He's a fine artist. He's incredibly talented. And today I'm here to teach you a little bit about my process and some of the tools that I use every day to accomplish them. And first we'll talk about concept art, next building a world, then lighting, and lastly color. And why these four exactly? Well, you know, they're very powerful when you use them correctly, but when they're often skipped and left to chance. So I learned concept art and storyboarding working at Disney. So I'm going to impart a couple of things I've learned along the way, exploring visual concepts, learning how to take time to save time, and digging into the details. And this is a concept art I did in Photoshop. It's a digital painting for Walmart Discovered, and really enjoyed doing it. We were exploring like a box cubic theme, so that's where you'll find a lot of cubic imagery. So going along with that, that was something we were exploring, that cubic imagery, exploring visual concepts. So what is that? It's when you take a motif, which is a repeating pattern to inform your style that reinforces your story. So for a project that we did for Sol de Janeiro, which is a beauty and skincare brand, I studied the Brazilian architecture of Rio and noticed a lot of similar shapes to the product in their architecture. And so I thought it would be a great visual concept to actually put the products everywhere you could see them, hide them in the city. So I thought that would be really great because you're constantly looking at the product and you're constantly thinking about the brand. So you have the Boom Boom cream, that's how you say it. It's not Bum Bum, it's Boom Boom. We have that in the windows, and we have the fragrance mist in the more narrow windows, and we just put them everywhere so you're constantly looking at the brand and it's constantly telling you that story. We did another big event for Kung Fu Panda. That was like one of the greatest things to work on. This was a tricky one because we had to start working on it before the movie came out, and we weren't allowed to see the movie more than once. So we had to like really dial it in and watch it one time and just pay attention to everything and just take it all in. So, but you know, they eventually gave us assets, but we started with sketches because that's all I really had. We had the knowledge from watching the movie. I was going frame by frame in the trailer, just trying to get every single piece of authentic architecture and like every detail correct. So, you know, starting with sketches is a great way to go. And that informed these pieces right here, which are beautiful. And we built a whole city out of these 3 buildings, and it just looked amazing. But we started way before we had the assets. We got sketches done, and we were able to, in the sketches, point out different details we wanted to get exactly right, like this curling arm and like the sign, getting the right angles and everything is really important. So start with sketches. And this is something you can do in Photoshop, which I do. This was done in Illustrator. I like doing stuff with architecture in Illustrator because you can copy and paste the different shapes and it just feels a little bit more clean to me. But you can do this on like a sketch, like a piece of paper, like on the back of a cocktail napkin. It's all about communicating the idea to your team. So speaking of saving time, in Sol de Janeiro, we got approvals for gameplay simply by showing an overhead map. And this is great for saving time because, you know, it's a lot easier to redraw a map than it is to, you know, undo your city that you just created And you can do a lot of time-saving steps just by erasing and redrawing. So you don't have to change anything when you're building. This is from Sol de Janeiro again. So raise your hand if you look for reference images online. Of course, yeah, everyone does. I do the same, but sometimes it's hard to find the right images, and sometimes when you do find them, it's not 100% accurate of like what you want it to be. It could be like the wrong color, or it could be just the style a little bit, and that room of error is difficult because sometimes the artists that you show it to run off in the direction you don't want them to. So it takes time off of revisions just by drawing your own reference images. So yeah, keep doing those sketches, create these like concept pieces. When you do something like this, you can really inform your entire team what you expect out of the colors and the shapes. In Crash Faster, it's a band by Morgan Tucker, his band, I probably know him. I illustrated every character, every prop, and every environment to show exactly what I wanted them to look like. So if I'm painting like this, like a tonal piece, I'll do it in Photoshop just so I can get like that painterly quality. But you can use anything free like Procreate. And for Kingship Islands, we received illustrations from the artists on their team, which was awesome. I'm constantly inspired by other artists, and especially my wonderful team. So we dug into the details of each drawing, the colors, the shapes, and really brought it to life. This whole building was my first model in a Blender. So I use Cinema 4D, but the Blender workflow in ROBLOX is pretty seamless. So for the next chapter, we'll be talking about building a world, from gray boxing to finding the scale, then building from the player's POV, and finally adding a piece of you. And this is from Fenty Beauty Skin Experience. That was the cream room, really beautiful. So there are 4 stages of a project. The first is concept art. The next is gray box. Then the art build. And then the finished map. And now the first 2 stages are often skipped. And you don't really need to do them, but if you do, you can take your project to the next level. And honestly, when we started this, we did very little of the first 2. And we eventually did this more and more as our projects got bigger, and it just helped out immensely. So let's dig into the details of what a gray box is. Gray boxing is a simplified look at your map, your world, everything in it as gray boxes. This helps you identify locations and objects in your world. It lets you play your game and see if it actually works before your scene is built, so you can make decisions on, do you need to move things around on the fly? And it helps plan for the next step, the art build. So you build your gray box, and you created your world in gray. Now you can think about the details that you might need in the scene and start replacing those gray boxes and what they represent. So these images from Kung Fu Panda really shows how we went from gray box to the final. Now can you see all the gray boxes and what they represented and how it kind of moved forward to the next step? And then once you have your gray box, really test it out. Scaling your experience will really help playability and increase playtime, which is always great. So think to yourself, where are my main gameplay areas? These are what I call landmarks. How many landmarks do we have? And how long does it take to get from one to the other? Because you don't want people to lose interest or get lost. So put yourself in their shoes. So when you're building, when you finally are moving props into your scene and you're actually building your scene, it's important to put yourself in your player's POV, in their point of view. So when I was building sets for stop motion at Disney, I would set the camera up and build the scene there. Anything that is in the scene, I composed it, made sure it looked really, really good, and just composed it from that angle. So when I started in ROBLOX, I did the same thing. I was like, okay, where are my players going to be? Where are they going to spawn in? What are they going to be seeing? And that's still how I do it today. Where your players going to be, they need to know what to do, where to go. So really help them out. And also when you're doing like thumbnails, it's great. You go back to these same places where you were composing your image. You just take pictures from there. You got like free thumbnails. So you go from each landmark. I'm going to be here. I spawn in here. That looks amazing. I need to go there, make that prominent, make sure it's like close enough, go there, and then look around. Where's the next place I need to be? What's the next thing I need to do? So in the world of branded experiences, and yes, we do a lot of them, but I love them. They're just amazing to work with, products and brands and filmmakers, finally, that you look up to. I mean, it's not bad getting feedback from Tim Burton. I think this is a hero of mine. That's crazy. So yeah, really loved working on that. But yeah, we do a lot of branded things, and sometimes you have a property that you need to expand out into an entire world. So it's on the art director and the team to figure out like what is all of this land. You have to put your spin on a lot of things because you have to make it up. There's a tree, but what kind of tree? There's a building, but what kind of building? So this is where you can put your own style on it. So think back on your life. What kind of things excite you? These are parts of you. This is part of your style. So, adding a piece of you is like important because it makes your work really stand out from the rest. And also, it's your style. Like no one else can do your style. So I really like industrial architecture. I like just organic lines and concrete for some reason. I really love forms made out of concrete. So a lot of concrete, a lot of organic shapes. I think it has like this timeless but epic quality that really makes things look cutting edge. Lighting. Everything is lighting, just letting you know. Lighting is my freaking favorite, sorry. But when you're trying to recreate these scenes from like Beetlejuice, and you see the time and care it takes to light these beautiful scenes, and it makes you feel a certain way, you really want to get that right when you're trying to reproduce it. So, it's something that really means a lot to me. In this section, we'll go through everything that revolves around lighting, storytelling with lighting, the power of lights, cinematic lighting, and my favorite lighting tricks. So storytelling with light. How do you want the players to feel throughout the game? It's not just, you can view it as just a game, but you're taking your players on a journey. So it could have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you have to treat each location as like a scene in a movie. That's what I do. So if they spawn in, that's like the first scene in the movie, and then you move them along on the path. So you have them feel a certain way at the beginning and a certain way at the end, and you kind of take them through this whole journey. So how can you do that with lights? You can have each of the places, each of these landmarks have a different feel. Take all of your levels, make them progress in a different way with lighting. So look at the image at the top from Fenty. That has a certain mood, so an enticing kind of magical, romantic feel. And that's a little bit different from what you look at when you see the rainforest on the right for Sol de Janeiro. It's like these different scenes in a movie, and that contrasted with these like iconic shots from Beetlejuice on the bottom that I just loved making. This is the waiting room, and then you have this cavernous area that was in the first movie, and everything just had to be right, but that mood had to be there as well from the movie. So you're creating these moods and these emotions. Now let's talk about the power of light. Light can instantly give the player context, like instantly. You know what time of day it is. You set the tone, you add the drama. It can guide your way and help direct the focus of your player. It also can make an ordinary scene look epic. Now look at these two pictures. The only difference is me turning off the lights and turning them back on. So I just turned off all of the lights I put into the scene, and it's drastically different. And without form, and then you have everything on the bottom, right? So you can tell just by the lights, what time of day it is, and you kind of feel like, I need to get from this point to that point. So you have gameplay just baked in with just the lighting. Cinematic lighting is not required for every game. A lot of Roblox games don't need it. But this is how I view anything when I'm making it. I come from the film background, so as soon as I think about how could this look, this is where my brain goes. So cinematic lighting is making your scene look like a movie. And how do you achieve this if you want to? Add depth with your atmosphere settings and really separate the background from the foreground, which is something like doing with a film camera with those settings. You can even use the depth of field effect. Those are just really easy ones to get in, but I love using the sun rays to create this soft gradation. And that was one of the first things oh, that really looks like a movie. When you put a sunset back there and it really blends all the colors together, like in Elton John right there, it just casts this gradient. So it makes your flat colors look like a little bit more blended into the scene. And it's a great way to start doing this if you haven't done it before and you want to, is take a still from a scene in a movie that you love and just analyze it. Where's the light? What's the tone of it? Put it side by side in your studio and just kind of try to match the lighting, the direction of the lighting, pay attention to where the shadows are, how they're treating the color, and just try to match it. Put those colors in it, and that's a great way to start. But when you're working with source material like Stranger Things, you can really analyze how they're doing it and really try to match it. That was a really fun project to work on. So cinematic lighting is also trying to produce a natural light. And that's something that I've learned here at Sawhorse, doing actual filming on sets. Sometimes you have to manipulate your lighting with film lights. Sometimes you have to shoot something in the dead of night, and it has to look like it's the afternoon. So you have to make this look natural with very unnatural sources. So one way to make your lights in Roblox look natural is by simulating global illumination. So what is global illumination? This is when a light is coming in and hits something, and it bounces and scatters across the surface. So how you can put this into practice is, see the picture here on the left? This is just one light coming through the window, straight in. But if you see on the right here, I've placed a couple of lights, one on the floor, so it comes in, hits the floor, you put the light on the floor, and it comes in and also bounces off the wall, so I put another light on the wall. Now, don't just quadruple all of your lights and think that's gonna solve everything. It actually might work horribly against you. And it also will crash your game, so don't do that. It's not good for optimization, it's not good for anything. So this was something big. This is a big room. This had a stained glass wall, light coming through. So if you hit that one element, if you do global illumination on this wall and the ground over here, it makes everything else look way more natural. So just pick a couple of different places you do this. That's important, that you want people to look at. Lighting an interior is sometimes a challenge when you have many objects in your scene. This is one of my favorite scenes in Beetlejuice that I worked on, and it's the boiler room. And when you have a lot of things in your room, things can get really dark and hard to light. So why don't you make it easy on yourself, remove the shadows from everything overhead or just anything around that area that might be blocking or creating a really, really dark room. And you're gonna see it really come to life and look great. So I use this this plugin called the Celestial Body Dragger, and it helps you move your sun or moon with your mouse, which is great. And I was, for the longest time, I was just using the time of day and the geographic latitude and trying to dial it in. But now you can just use it with just dragging your mouse around. This Celestial Body Dragger by Maximum ADHD, such a brilliant plugin. The last section we're going to talk about is color. And we're going to talk about color and emotion, balancing light and color, and gameplay signals. My father is a fine artist, so I learned a lot of what I consider my color lessons from his oil paintings. Just looking at his oil paintings all day and just like, well, how did he do that? Why did he do that? And painters really pick their colors with emotional intention, and you can do that, with ROBLOX when you're creating a scene. So balancing light and color seems like an easy thing to do, but it's really, really not. You have to remember two things. Your skybox. Your skybox is huge. It affects every color in your scene. So in the photo from Elton John, at the top, you see that the sun is coming through and really giving all of this, the whole scene, like it's warming up the shadows. It's changing all of your colors to be a little bit more warm. And this is great in a way, but also you have to make sure that if there are colors in your scene that you need to be perfect, you might have to counterbalance what your scene is doing with the skybox. So in Sliving Land, we have this skybox that's pink, and it's just baking this pink into everything that we're doing. And I really love the way that feels. So we broke it up with the neon details, but it was really interesting how that was predominantly, the whole look of it is basically the skybox. And when you're doing things like branded material, like we often do, we have to counteract and rebalance their brand colors and to make everything look like what you're going to buy or the characters you'll see in a movie. So you really have to make sure that all of these brand colors, the color of the makeup, the color of the characters in this Kung Fu Panda, that they're really representative of what is trying to be shown. Color and emotion. I'm all about emotion. My username, Heart Hurts, has a lot to do with emotion. I love things that really make you feel something. I love Pixar movies that just makes, when it tugs at your heartstrings. So yeah, that's a big thing of what I try to do and what I make. So do you feel a difference between these two images? The first one is like relaxed, and it makes you feel just like warm and a sense of being calm. And the other one has like an electric and bold feeling and a little bit of magical. I might have lit that too bright. Kind of looks like a nuclear bomb went off, but I love that stuff. So all of these colors, everything that you see here, it makes you feel different ways. So a trick that I use if you want to make something a little softer and more relaxed, like the one on the left, is by limiting your color palette and try to choose a couple of different colors, like 2 or 3. And you'll see that it produces different effects. Sometimes if you have one color, it has this really very dramatic feel, but sometimes it calls for it. So try that out. So in the left, we have creams, brown, and pink. And I feel like my character standing in there is all aesthetic as well, with the pink popsicle and the boar's head that's brown. It's always good. Okay, lastly, color for gameplay. So this was a tricky one for me coming from film. So for this one, I was trying to do kind of like Sin City. I don't know if you kind of know that movie, but it was going for a bold, comic look, and just shoved a bunch of saturated lights in the scene. And color for gameplay is imperative. It helps the player navigate your map, and it directs them where to go. But this is very tricky when you're trying to do something kind of freaky with the color to begin with. And bright lights that are saturated, people will kind of look for cues when they're playing. And if something's red or something's green or something's blue, sometimes that stuff means stuff to people, especially when you're coming from other games that do it so well. So you got to make sure that you're being cognizant of what colors that you're using. For Kingship Islands, I had all my whole style here. I was this looks so cool, man. The whole thing is perfect. And then we started gameplay testing, and people were like hopping around and like doing crazy stuff, and like they're avoiding different areas. They're like running into the bushes, and I'm like, this is obviously not what we want. We want you to collect these things on the ground. Why are you guys acting so weird? And they're like, well, that's obviously lava over there. Something's going to explode, or something's going to burn me, and I'm going to die. So I'm avoiding that, and I'm running into the bushes because I don't know why, but there's green over there. So you got to keep in mind all of this stuff affects them. You want to help the player as much as possible. Help them help you. Really help them play their game the way you want it to. So here's some takeaways from my art process. Remember to find those visual concepts while doing concept art. Sketch things out to save time. Build your world from the player's POV and add a special piece of you. Tell a cinematic story with lighting, and balance color and light for an emotional response. And these are just some of the many things that I've learned finding my art direction. And now it's time to find yours. So what direction will you go next? Thank you so much, and I'd love to answer some of your questions. Dude, Sawhorse is representing right now. Oh my gosh. They're really talented people in the room. Even you guys too. I'm so excited you guys are here. Is anybody have questions? Nothing too technical. Please.
Hi. What made you make the switch from the animation industry to the video game industry?
Those two guys right there.
Oh, yeah.
They made me. No, like it was a big initiative over at Sawhorse. Like we want to make these games. Who's passionate about gaming? And all of our hands went up. So it was really hard to see who was going to stick around to do post-production. But no, we're really strong on both ends now. We have a big post-production department that helps us with our gameplay as well. So once we have our entire project launching, we have the team in post-production creating all the promotional material for social, and it's really awesome. We just started doing like tutorials, video tutorials on how to play our game, which is super amazing. So I'm excited about that. But what made me, I love video games. I was actually traumatized by video games when I was little. My father, the fine artist, he didn't let me have a Nintendo or any gaming system until I was 18 years old.
Wow.
So now I'm making games for a living, Dad. Anybody else?
I hope this is not too technical. You were talking about lights, about how many of them can ruin performance. And I was wondering if you have a recommendation on what's like the limit of lights that you should have in a scene.
If you want to analyze the first couple games that I made, don't do that. It did. Yeah, I think you know when it's too much. But I would say it depends really, like how big your environment is and what you need to do. I would say err on the at least you need to do. I would go back once you've completed your scene and turn them on and off and see if you really need them. And this really comes in handy for optimizing, but I forgot to mention, but there's a plugin by Woot 3 that's the lighting editor. And that was something that I use every like 20 minutes. It's a very powerful plugin. It shows you where all of your lights are and what type of light, what color it is. And it really helps you troubleshoot. If anything's like really bright and you're like, why is that just nuclear? And you can just see like, oh, when you click it on, it shows you all the lights. And like, oh, I put like 18 lights right there. That's probably it. So I'm trying to give you like a good estimate. I would say, well, the information that I got from the devs is you don't want there's radius or diameter of the light coming out. You don't want those to kind of cross over each other, although I do it all the time and I love doing it. I love giant lights. I like stretching it all the way to 60 and just like putting whatever feels right there and then remove what's not needed. Did that help?
So you don't say to yourself, I'm gonna only add 4 lights. You add as many as you can, then check the plugin and...
As many as necessary, not as many as I can.
Okay.
I've been hit on the arm too many times for doing that.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Hi. Firstly, I just want to say that I'm Brazilian, and your pronunciation for boom boom is spot on.
Thank you. Validation, I love it.
I just wanted to know, how do you communicate the art direction with the rest of the team? Like, do you create Bibles or documents?
Oh, yes. So communicating, I have a couple things for that. I really think communicating with your team is important. Team morale is really important. When you're starting some big, project that everyone's excited about, the people that know about it are excited about, it's really great to have like a welcoming meeting with them and just gather them around and really get people hyped on what it is. Some people might know certain parts, certain details about the project. Is this a musical or is this a movie? And it's really cool to get them all excited about it at the same time and also introduce each team member to each other. As far as workflow is concerned, Milanote is something that I use personally. We've used a couple of different things, but I like to lay things out in there. Why do I like doing that? It's on a grid system, and it makes everything really clean. And then you can also put all your images in there, and you can zoom way in, and so you can put a whole bunch of stuff in there. You can always copy and paste. I think you can copy and paste pictures as well, which is not easy to do with other apps. Do you use Milanote?
Usually I use FigJam for it.
Okay, yeah, that's great too. We use that on other projects, but with my mindset, I feel like Milanote helps me really well. And then as far as like workflow, sometimes we just do, on some projects, all of the tasks, map it out in Milanote, but then we also use Jira as well when it gets a little crunchier.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Over here.
Nobody's want to see me dance?
So this is a question regarding Lamborghini Labs, a project.
Okay, cool, yeah.
The headquarters building, was that a design that you yourself and the team concepted, or was it one that Lamborghini gave to you? And if so, what was the inspiration for it? Okay, so a lot of that is just stuff I love that for when you're pitching this stuff out, at Sawhorse we like to build it to what we think it would look like at the very beginning, and really pitch the final product. And that was something that I worked with this very talented artist Santiago to make, and he works out of Colombia, and we just giggle every morning and like make beautiful things, and it just came out of a little bit of exploration. We wanted it to be epic. We wanted it to be like the most exciting thing that could house the Lamborghini. I thought it was pretty epic to put it in a desert. And a lot of their promotional material, there's a little bit of there was a lot of elements from the promotional material that we kind of bit off of as well. But yeah, a little bit of everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.